Hey guys, Cat is here. How you doing today? Certainly hope you're doing well. We are in the kitchen again, and with everything that's going on in the world, the threat of nuclear war, prepping is at its peak probably in the last few years. As most of you know, I've been prepping for about 15 years, and not only do I prep, but I teach and train survival. And here's something that I think you're going to find really handy in the kitchen. So what Kelly and I are doing is we're doing something that's called dry canning. And basically, if you understand the process of regular canning, where you either use a bath type pot or a pressure cooker to can, what we're canning is dry goods, like, for instance, oats, cornmeal, Kodiak cakes, which are pancakes and waffles, and this is gluten-free. We're doing the spaghetti. We're also doing some gluten-free flour, some almond flour, and oats. Now, the one thing that you'll notice about this is that a lot of these ingredients are gluten-free. Now, oats are naturally gluten-free, cornmeal is naturally gluten-free, and oat flour is naturally gluten-free. Some of these things are not gluten-free, like the spaghetti. That has gluten in it. The almond flour and the gluten-free flour obviously is gluten-free. Now, the reason why this is because in our household, we try to go gluten-free sometimes, not all the time. And sometimes we're a little sensitive to the gluten. So depending on what we're eating that day is going to depend on what we make. So I'm going to go through and kind of go through step by step how to dry can doing this process. And it's really simple. The one thing I want to tell you about is that the alphabet groups of the government say that this isn't a certified way to actually can. So, take it with a grain of salt. I don't find any problems with it. There's a ton of other videos on YouTube about how to dry can, but this is how I do it. I think it's a really good process. I've compiled a lot of information. I've done a lot of research on this. And this is what I come up with, and I think it's a good way to do it, so let's get started. All right, guys, so the first step of dry canning is taking care of the jars, the lids, and the rings. So what I've already done is I've already washed all the jars, I've washed the lids, and I've washed the rings. And what I've done is I've set my oven to 170 degrees, if you see the oven over here. And the reason why I do 170 is because I would say 99% of all bacteria gets killed at 160 degrees, as we know. So ovens can have a variation of temperature. So if I go 10 degrees above 160 to 170, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to kill about 99% of all the bacteria that's remaining in the jars. Also, what this does is that after washing the jars, when I put them in the oven to do this, it helps to make sure that they are absolutely dry. And as you can see, I've got several different sizes in there. I've got pints, and in the back they're 1.5 pints. I love the 1.5 pint jars. So basically, this is how you're going to dry and sterilize your jars, and this is the starting process of dry canning. All right, guys, today I'm going to show you a quick process on how to put whatever it is that you're dry canning into the can. If you check this out right here, I'll be doing some oat flour, and just like the process I explained on how to clean and then sterilize your jar. In fact, this one is still warm, believe it or not. So I've got my handy dandy funnel, and that helps to keep things a little neater. It can get messy at times. So I'm just going to dump the flour in here a little bit at a time, not too much. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump it down a little bit. And what I mean by that is to keep the stress off of the jar, I'm going to use something that has some padding like this hot pad. And I'm just going to bump it down. And if you had an opportunity to look inside there, you could see some of the air that's coming out between the granules of the flour, and it's almost like creating a tiny fissure when it comes up. As you can see, I bounced that down quite a bit. So now I can continue adding some more flour here. And again, you want to concentrate on your headspace. It's still important to keep the headspace of the canning jar, but if you knock it down like this, you can get more in it. But you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to overdo knocking it down, or you don't want to push it down where you cram it in there. You want to have it just sitting natural in a sense. You don't want to apply too much pressure to the flour. So we're going to see if we can get all the rest of this in here. I'm hoping that we can. There's just a smidgen left. Trying to make it even a little bit there. And I still do have some headspace left. It's important to keep that headspace just the same. I've got a little tiny bit room left. A little tiny bit left in the bag. There. That is about going to do it. Let's see if I can get all this in there. Oh, look at that. Perfect. Perfect. Now the reason why I'm tipping it is because I want it to move more towards my hand, just to keep it nice and flat, keep it nice and level. So there we go. We were able to get all that in the jar, the last bit of it. And I got good headspace on there. So another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label this with an O, because it's oat flour. And we have different types of flours and ingredients that look similar. So I'm going to put an O on this. That way I know it's oat flour. Alright guys, here's a little tip that's going to avoid being confused when you take these things out of the oven. And that is that if you notice, a lot of these products look alike. They have the same shade pretty much. It's very hard to tell the difference between the gluten-free flour and the oat flour. So all you got to do is just put a letter on there. This is oat flour. I put an O. This is gluten-free flour. I put a G, because when we put these in the oven, we're going to put them in there without the lids on there for 45 minutes. And I'm going to explain that part when we get to it. So when you have all the lids off, you're not going to be able to tell which one goes to which, because all these lids are the same size, even though the jars are different. I have quart jars, I have pint and a half, and I have pint jars, but the quart and the pint and a half have the same size lid. So it's going to be really confusing if I don't label it what product is which, because just by looking at it, it's easy to get it confused. Alright guys, so now we are at the process of getting this stuff into the oven, and there's a few things that you need to do here for safety reasons. And the first thing you need to do is turn up the temperature. Like I said, we are at 170 degrees. Now, we're going to go to 220. The reason why we're going to go to 220 is because the boiling temperature of water is right around 202 degrees, if I'm not wrong. And depending on your altitude is going to make a difference as to, a couple degrees here or there. So my point being, at 220, we're going to be well past the boiling point of water. And because different ovens have a variance in accuracy with the amount of temperature that it's set at, this oven, even though it says 220, let's just say it's like, ends up being like 215, because I haven't had it calibrated exactly where the temperature is. So I'm going to go above the boiling temperature of water, which is going to kill all the bacteria of what's in there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take the lids off of these, and which is why I said you have to label them, because it's going to get confusing if you don't label them. We're going to put them in the oven for 45 minutes at 220 degrees. And what this does is that it helps remove any moisture that might be remaining in the product, and it helps create a cleaner environment in the jar, because too much moisture in the jar could lead to getting bacteria or mold or other things like that in your process of your food. So what we do here is this gives the product an opportunity to warm up inside the jar, and it gives it an opportunity to reduce the amount of moisture that's in the jar, and that's going to be really helpful. So we continue putting these in here. As you can see, I'm spacing them out just a little bit. Doesn't need to be perfect. Now, there's one thing that I do want to talk about, and some of you may be surprised that I am doing cornmeal, because cornmeal can get really tricky, because some cornmeals like Jiffy already have sugar in their product. So that is essentially a no-no. You don't want to can, or even dry can, wet can or dry can, something that is a sugar-based product, because it's going to cause some problems, and we don't need any more problems than we already have. So if you're using Jiffy, you might want to read the instruction, or rather the ingredients, and see what's in there. And I am using yellow Quaker cornmeal, and if you look at the ingredients, sugar is not one of them. Sugar is not in there. So this should be fine for dry canning, because there's no sugar. But either way, make sure you pay attention to that. Now, we got this at 220. I'm going to have that in there. Now we're going to set our timer. We're going to set our timer for 45 minutes. In this process of 45 minutes, this is where we're going to sterilize the lids. And when I come back, I'm going to show you how to do that. Alright guys, I'm going to explain to you how it is that you sterilize your lids. Because this isn't pressure canning, and the temperature inside the jars, it gets a little higher in pressure canning. It gets to about between 225 to 250 is possible inside of a pressure canner. You want to make sure that because we're dry canning, that you sterilize the lids. And that's actually really simple. We're going to add this process to what we're doing right now with the jars that are currently in the oven. I currently have the jars in the oven, obviously without the lids. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this in here. If you notice, I have my lower rack. The purpose of the lower rack is to put the lids in there. And now we're going to leave that in there for 15 minutes. When those lids come out, they will be completely sterilized. So when we are done with this process of eliminating some of the moisture in the jars, we're going to put the lids on, and then we're going to go into our final process of dry canning. Alright guys, so now the first process of dry canning is done, and that would be putting the jars in the oven without the lids. Now, as I explained earlier, we have the rings and the lids here that are now sterilized, and the jars are in the oven. So I'm going to take the jars from the oven, and I'm now going to put the lids on. It's just a very simple process. I have gloves on because they're just a touch warm. I'm just gonna wipe the rim real good here. I'm looking for the cornmeal lid. There we go. It's nice and clean. Just gonna set that on there. Just a little snug, not overly tight. I'm gonna grab another cornmeal lid. Put that on there. Do that. Another cornmeal. Alright, so you guys get the idea of what I'm doing here. When I come back, I'm going to show you how we put them in the oven. Alright guys, so we have all the lids on and we all have them on the right jar because I labeled them. Well, the label came off, but good enough. So we got it all labeled properly. We're going to put it back into the oven real quick. Again, I'm using gloves because they're a little warm. They're not blasting hot, but they are a little warm. If you're quick about it, it's no big deal really. It's a real easy process for the most part. Get them back into the oven here. Everything's going pretty well. Can't really complain. Try not to crowd them too much. You just got the last 4 cornmeals. That should about do it. So that's good enough. I'm going to close the oven. Again, we're at 220 degrees. And now I'm going to set the timer for this process. I'm going to do 1 hour and 5 minutes. The reason why I'm going to do 1 hour and 5 minutes is because we had the door open. I want to give it 5 minutes to get it back up to temperature. And then it's going to be a good solid 1 hour processing with the lids on. So this is the final process of dry canning. Now, there's something very, very important. It's just like pressure canning. After this hour goes by, you don't want to open the oven door. Just like pressure canning, you want to give it some time. You want this temperature to go down, and you want it to slowly, slowly, slowly come back down to room temperature. You might even want to take 2 hours for this to come down. After like an hour, hour and a half, you can crack the door just a little bit, but don't open it all the way, because what happens is if you take these out right away, obviously going from 220 degrees to room temperature is a big spike. What can happen is condensation will build up inside your jar. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not going to give you botulism or any type of bacteria or anything like that, because inside that jar it's very sterilized. So that moisture that you're getting is going to be sterilized moisture. It's almost going to be like distilled water in a sense. It's not enough water or moisture to cause botulism. If you do have some condensation inside of your jar, your product is going to absorb that. Now, the reason why I know it's not going to cause botulism is because I researched that. In order for botulism to form, you need a good amount of moisture inside your jar. Hence, which is where botulism comes from pressure canning, because you have a lot of broth in your meat. You might have a lot of broth or juice or water in your vegetables. So when it comes to the point of getting botulism, it's probably not going to happen with dry goods because they are dry goods. And there's not enough water in there to cause botulism. Now to finish the video, I want to show you what we've done already so far. This has been a fantastic effort by both me and my wife, who's obviously holding the camera. And this is what we've done so far. And honestly, I'm surprised by how much we have. You know, we've done oat flour, we've done almond flour, we've done pasta, we've done oats. And one of the reasons why we did oats is because oats is one of those things, it's gluten-free naturally. But the one thing about oats is that you can eat them whole, you can bake with them, you can do all kinds of things with them. You can add them into gravies and things like that if you want to make it a nice lumpy gravy. Oats is like that utility food that you can really have. It's very hearty, it's very nutritious. But the other thing about oats in this raw form is that you can grind this down into oat flour. So not only do you have a meal as how it is, you can also make bread out of these oats once you mill them down into a flour, which is really awesome about oats. They're very nutritious. They're a very good product to have in your kitchen. It should be a staple item in your kitchen and in your pantry. Oats are really awesome. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried to cover every aspect of dry canning. It's been really fun doing this. Kelly and I have had a blast. She's holding the camera for me, and I really appreciate that. And any questions, leave them in the comments. But again, you know, it's a great way to fill your pantry and add shelf life to these dry goods.